Isabella Michaelson thought the hardest part was over when she said I do to the most powerful vampire king alive. But as their private jet soared toward the Scottish Highlands, for what should have been a perfect honeymoon, 3 encrypted messages arrived simultaneously on Klaus's phone. Messages that made his ancient blood run cold, and his protective fury ignite like supernatural wildfire. Because while they'd been celebrating their eternal love, 3 separate armies had been mobilizing with one terrifying goal: prove that a human bride could never truly survive what it meant to be a Michaelson. And they were willing to turn their honeymoon into a battlefield to do it. 3 days into what should have been the most perfect honeymoon in history, Isabella Michaelson woke up in her vampire king husband's ancient Scottish castle to find bloody raven feathers scattered across their bedroom floor, and a message carved into the stone wall: "The real war begins now." She reached for Niklaus but found only cold sheets, and the lingering scent of something that made her newly awakened supernatural senses scream danger. Because while she'd been dreaming of forever, 3 separate armies of enemies had been converging on the one place she thought she'd finally be safe. Isabella's bare feet touched the cold stone floors of Raven's Hollow Castle, as pale moonlight streamed through ancient stained glass windows, casting ethereal patterns of blue and silver across the massive bedchamber that had been home to Michaelson royalty for over a millennium. The silk nightgown she wore, a wedding gift from Rebecca made from fabric that had once belonged to medieval queens, billowed around her as she moved toward the far wall where jagged words had been carved deep into stones that had withstood centuries of Highland storms. "The real war begins now." The message was fresh, stone dust still settling like ash on the Persian rugs below, which meant someone had been in their most private sanctuary while they slept. Someone fast enough, quiet enough and powerful enough to breach Nikolaus's supernatural defenses, without waking the most dangerous predator alive or his newly heightened bride. Her fingers traced the rough carved letters, and immediately her enhanced senses picked up traces of whoever had violated their sanctuary. The scent was wrong, not fully human but not quite vampire either. Something hybrid, something that made every instinct she'd developed since entering the supernatural world scream warnings of imminent danger. Mixed with the strange smell was something else that made her stomach turn, the metallic tang of spilled blood and the sharp burn of magical herbs that didn't belong in the Scottish Highlands. "Nick," she called softly, her voice echoing through the cavernous chamber that had been their private paradise for 3 blissful days. They'd barely left this room since arriving from New Orleans, making love on ancient floors where kings had once planned battles, sharing intimate conversations by the massive fireplace where Nikolaus had told her stories of his human life over 1,000 years ago. The bloody raven feathers scattered across their silk sheets made her newly sensitive stomach lurch with dread. She'd learned enough about supernatural culture to know that ravens meant death, prophecy, and dark magic. Someone had clearly left them as a calling card, but the implications went beyond simple threats. In the supernatural world, ravens were messengers between the living and the dead, and their presence meant ancient magic was at work. She picked up one of the larger feathers, and immediately her enhanced senses were overwhelmed with visions that shouldn't have been possible. Images flashed through her mind, Daniel's face twisted with rage and desperation, strange figures in dark robes chanting in languages that hurt to hear, maps of the castle marked with attack points, and something else, something that made her blood run cold. Images of her own death, over and over, in dozens of different ways. Through the blood bond she now shared with Nikolaus, stronger than any marriage vow, connecting their very souls, she felt his fury building like a supernatural storm somewhere deep in the castle. His rage was so intense it made her head throb and her newly sensitive nervous system sing with sympathetic energy. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to pull the most powerful vampire alive away from their honeymoon bed before dawn, serious enough to make a being who'd lived for over a millennium genuinely concerned. She moved to the massive windows that overlooked the endless Scottish countryside, pushing aside heavy velvet curtains that had been woven by craftsmen long dead. The view should have been breathtaking: rolling hills covered in morning mist, ancient forests that stretched to the horizon, the wild beauty of the highlands that Nikolaus had promised to show her during their month-long honeymoon. But something was fundamentally wrong with the landscape before her. The shadows moved too deliberately, held too many shapes that didn't belong in nature. Her enhanced vision picked up movement where there should have been stillness, heat signatures where the moor should have been empty. Her heart hammered as she realized they weren't alone on the remote estate that Nikolaus had inherited from his human father centuries before his transformation. Shapes moved through the forest with purpose and coordination, too many to count, too organized to be accidental. Some moved with supernatural speed, others with the careful precision of trained soldiers, and others still seemed to float rather than walk, suggesting magical rather than physical threats. The morning mist wasn't natural either. It swirled with patterns that suggested it was being controlled, used as cover for whatever forces had surrounded their sanctuary. Meanwhile, for floors below in the castle's ancient war room that hadn't been used for actual warfare in over 2 centuries, Nikolaus stood before a massive stone table that had been carved from a single block of highland granite by his human father's craftsmen. Maps, both ancient and modern, covered every inch of the surface, hand-drawn battle plans from medieval conflicts, satellite imagery of the current estate grounds, and supernatural tracking charts that showed energy signatures around the castle perimeter. His siblings had gathered in emergency session, arriving throughout the night by various supernatural means as threats materialized around their family stronghold. They stood around the war table like the ancient generals they'd once been, their usual modern facades dropped to reveal the deadly predators who'd survived 1,000 years of supernatural politics and warfare. 3 separate armies, Elijah reported grimly, his usually perfect composure strained with exhaustion and barely controlled fury. He'd been coordinating intelligence gathering since midnight, using his network of supernatural contacts across Europe to piece together the scope of the threat. The Bennett witch coven arrived just after sunset yesterday, claiming Isabella's potential transformation must be supervised by supernatural law. They're already positioning themselves in the village below, and their combined magical power is strong enough to sense every supernatural being within 50 miles. He pointed to thermal imaging that showed heat signatures arranged in precise magical formations around the village that lay at the base of the mountain. 27 witches, including some of the most powerful practitioners in the Western Hemisphere. They've established a magical perimeter that would be difficult even for us to breach without significant casualties. The Salvatore faction believes our marriage violates ancient accords that predate the founding of New Orleans, Rebecca added, her voice sharp with the kind of irritation that typically preceded mass destruction. She gestured to photographs of armed figures that had been taken by hidden castle security systems. They've brought vampire hunters equipped with enough vervain-laced weapons to stock a small army, plus some very expensive supernatural tracking equipment and what appear to be magical binding devices. The photos showed professional soldiers armed with weapons that glowed with supernatural energy, their positions carefully chosen to cut off every possible escape route from the castle. Klaus could smell their determination even from this distance, along with the fear that drove them to face beings they knew could tear them apart in seconds. They have witches of their own backing them, Cole added with the kind of grin that usually meant someone was about to die horribly. Not as powerful as the Bennett Coven, but specialized in anti-vampire magic. Whoever's funding this operation has done their research and spared no expense. Klaus's eyes flashed gold with barely contained fury as his hands braced against the ancient stone, leaving finger-shaped impressions in granite that had withstood centuries of highland weather. Through their blood bond, he felt Isabella's confusion and growing fear 4 floors above, her heart rate accelerating as her enhanced senses picked up the supernatural tension surrounding them. He'd promised her safety when she'd agreed to spend forever with him, promised her that becoming a Michaelson meant ultimate protection, not walking into the supernatural equivalent of a war zone. And the third threat? Klaus asked, his voice carrying the promise of violence that had made him feared across continents for over a millennium. That's the truly fascinating development, Cole smirked, though his expression remained deadly serious as he produced a series of photographs and documents. A certain human named Daniel Rothschild has apparently made some very expensive and very dangerous new friends. Word through supernatural channels is that he's convinced some rather powerful entities that our dear sister-in-law is being held against her will through compulsion. The photos showed Daniel meeting with figures whose faces were obscured by shadow and magic, exchanging briefcases full of what appeared to be both money and supernatural artifacts. Bank records indicated transfers of wealth that could have bought small countries, all traceable to accounts linked to some of the oldest supernatural families in Europe. He's not just seeking revenge, Elijah observed, studying the intelligence reports with growing concern. He genuinely believes he's conducting a rescue operation. The beings he's allied with have convinced him that no human could willingly choose our world, that Isabella must be under supernatural influence. Klaus's phone, reinforced with magic to withstand his supernatural strength, cracked under the pressure of his grip as he processed the full scope of the threat. How long before they coordinate their attack? Brother, Elijah replied quietly, meeting Klaus's dangerous gaze with the kind of solemn expression that had preceded some of their family's most brutal conflicts. They're not preparing to attack. They're already in position and have been since before midnight. We've been surrounded, cut off, and systematically isolated. The question isn't when they'll move, it's what they're waiting for. As if summoned by his words, Klaus's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the message appearing in letters that seemed to burn across the screen. Tick-tock, husband. Time to see if your human wife can survive what it really means to be a Michaelson. The sun rises in 1 hour, and then the real test begins. And that's how a perfect honeymoon turns into a supernatural war zone with everything Isabella thought she knew about safety hanging in the balance. But before I tell you how the most dangerous vampire king in existence handles 3 armies trying to take his new wife, you absolutely must hit that subscribe button. I'm literally sacrificing sleep to bring you this epic continuation, crafting every twist to keep you on the edge of your seat, and if you're this invested in Isabella and Nikolaus's story, you belong in our vampire family. One click shows me you're ready for this wild ride. Also, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I need to know where my supernatural story addicts are scattered across the globe because this is about to get intense. 3 enemies, 1 castle, and a human bride caught in the middle. What do you think Nikolaus should do first? Protect Isabella by hiding her away from danger, or bring her into the fight so she can prove she belongs in the supernatural world? And more importantly, what do you think Daniel's real endgame is here? Drop your theories below because this war is just beginning. Isabella's bare feet barely touched the stone steps as she raced down the ancient spiral staircase, her silk nightgown billowing behind her like ghostly wings. The castle that had felt like a fairy tale sanctuary just hours ago now seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, shadows stretching too long in the flickering torchlight, whispers echoing from empty corridors that suggested the very walls were holding their breath. The bond with Nikolaus pulled her like a supernatural magnet, his emotions bleeding into hers through their shared connection, fury that burned like molten lava, protective rage that threatened to consume everything in its path, and underneath it all, a fear so deep and primal it made her chest tighten with sympathetic panic. She'd felt him angry before, had witnessed his legendary temper during their courtship, but this was different. This was the terror of a being who'd lived for over a millennium suddenly faced with the possibility of losing the one thing that made eternity worth living. Her enhanced senses picked up fragments of heated conversation drifting up from the war room, voices sharp with tension, the rustle of maps being moved urgently across stone surfaces, and underneath it all, the metallic scent of weapons being prepared for battle. The smell of vervain was so strong it made her eyes water, mixed with wolfsbane and other supernatural deterrents that suggested they were preparing for every possible type of enemy. She burst through the heavy oak doors to find Nikolaus surrounded by his siblings, all of them looking more dangerous and predatory than she'd ever witnessed. Ancient weapons lined the stone walls like a medieval armory, swords that gleamed with supernatural enchantments, crossbows fitted with vervain-tipped bolts, and artifacts that hummed with magical energy accumulated over centuries of supernatural warfare. Maps covered every available surface, surveillance photos were scattered across the massive table, and the air itself crackled with tension so thick it was difficult to breathe. Love, Nikolaus's voice broke the moment he saw her, relief and anguish warring in his expression as his ancient eyes took in her disheveled state. In 3 supernatural strides that seemed to blur reality around him, he reached her, his hands cupping her face with the kind of desperate gentleness that spoke of a man barely holding himself together. "You should be sleeping. You should be safe in our bed, dreaming of forever, not standing in a war room surrounded by plans for violence." "Safe?" Isabella's voice cracked as she took in the military precision preparations around them, the way his siblings had positioned themselves like generals planning a siege, the sheer scope of weaponry that suggested they were preparing for a supernatural apocalypse. "Nick, what's happening out there? What are those things I can smell surrounding us? Why does the air taste like death and old magic?" His ancient eyes, usually so confident and commanding, usually holding the arrogance of a being who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve through superior force and strategic brilliance, filled with something she'd never seen before in their entire relationship, genuine, bone-deep terror. Not fear for his own existence, he'd faced that countless times over the centuries, but existential terror for her safety, for her life, for the possibility that his love had painted a target on her back that might prove impossible to erase. "They've come for you, Isabella," he whispered, his voice breaking completely as the words seemed to tear themselves from his throat. "All of them. 3 separate armies, each with their own agenda, but all focused on the same goal. Because you're human in a supernatural world, because you're mine in a realm where possession means power, because they think." His voice shattered entirely, the sound more heartbreaking than anything she'd ever heard. "Because they think I've stolen your free will, compelled your love, forced you into a life you never would have chosen freely." The words hit her like physical blows, each syllable landing with the force of supernatural strength against mortal flesh. She felt her knees threaten to buckle as the full implications crashed through her consciousness like a tsunami of realization. This wasn't just about their happiness, their future, their perfect honeymoon paradise. This was about the fundamental question that had haunted supernatural human relationships for millennia. Could a mortal truly love a monster by choice, or was every such union built on manipulation and magical coercion? She saw it reflected in his siblings' faces now, the careful way they avoided direct eye contact with her, the protective stance they'd taken around their brother, the subtle positioning that suggested they saw her as both precious cargo to be protected and a potential liability that might get them all killed. For the first time since their wedding ceremony, since passing those supernatural trials that had granted her acceptance into their world, Isabella felt the crushing weight of being the weak link, the human anomaly in an immortal family, the variable that threatened to bring down a dynasty that had survived for over 1,000 years. "They want to test me again," she whispered, understanding flooding through her with the clarity of dawn breaking over a battlefield. "They want to prove that what we have isn't real." Nikolaus's silence, the way his jaw clenched with barely controlled fury, the way his hands trembled slightly against her face despite his supernatural control, was answer enough. The most powerful vampire in existence, the original hybrid who had never backed down from any fight, was terrified of a test he couldn't take for her, a challenge he couldn't face in her place, a trial that would force her to prove her humanity's strength against supernatural forces designed to break mortal minds and spirits. Around them, ancient castle stones seemed to pulse with the weight of destiny, and Isabella realized that their perfect honeymoon had just transformed into the most dangerous trial of her life. "No," Nikolaus said with deadly finality, his hands tightening on Isabella's shoulders with enough force that she could feel the supernatural strength barely held in check beneath his touch. His voice carried the absolute authority of a being who had commanded armies, toppled kingdoms, and bent supernatural law to his will for over a millennium. "Absolutely not. I don't care what ancient laws they cite, what traditions they claim we violated, or what supernatural tribunals they think have jurisdiction over our marriage. You will not be subjected to trials designed by beings who see you as nothing more than expendable entertainment." Isabella stepped back from his protective embrace, and he immediately felt the loss like a physical wound. Her spine straightened with that same defiance that had first caught his attention in a New Orleans alley 6 months ago, when she'd faced down 3 attackers with nothing but human courage and righteous fury. That fearless determination that had made him fall in love with her was now turning against his desperate need to keep her safe, and the irony wasn't lost on any of the siblings watching this domestic conflict unfold against the backdrop of supernatural warfare. "And if I refuse their trials?" Isabella's voice rang with frustrated challenge as she gestured toward the maps and surveillance photos that painted a picture of their complete encirclement. What happens to you? To your family? To everyone in that village below who might get caught in the crossfire? Do these 3 armies just pack up and disappear because the big bad vampire king says no? Do centuries of supernatural politics and ancient grudges just evaporate because you're protective of your human wife? Her words hit their mark with surgical precision. Klaus had spent 1,000 years believing that superior force and strategic ruthlessness could solve any problem, that the right application of violence could overcome any obstacle. But Isabella had just highlighted the fundamental flaw in that worldview. Some battles couldn't be won through strength alone, especially when the stakes included not just their love but the safety of innocent bystanders and the delicate balance of supernatural politics that kept their world from erupting into open warfare. We handle it the way we've always handled threats to this family, Klaus replied coldly, his voice taking on the merciless tone that had made him feared across continents. We eliminate them. Completely. Permanently. We turn this castle into a fortress and remind the supernatural world why crossing the Michaelson family has historically been a fatal mistake. By starting a supernatural war that could last centuries and spread across continents? Isabella's voice rose with a frustration that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. The quiet, thoughtful woman they'd welcomed into their family was revealing a backbone of steel that refused to bend even under the pressure of facing down ancient supernatural politics. How many innocent people die because I was too scared to prove myself worthy of this family? How many communities get destroyed because you decided to wage war instead of letting me face a challenge I might actually be able to handle? Rebecca stepped forward from her position near the ancient weapons display, her expression gentle but edged with the kind of concern that came from having lived through centuries of supernatural trials and their often gruesome outcomes. Isabella, darling, I don't think you fully understand what these trials typically entail. They're not testing your love for our brother or your commitment to this family or even your courage, though you've proven all of those beyond question. They're testing whether a human mind and body can survive what it truly means to be a Michaelson in a world where we have enemies that date back to the origins of our species. She moved to the table and pulled out a leather-bound journal that looked older than most civilizations, its pages filled with accounts written in multiple languages and time periods. The mortality rate for humans subjected to supernatural trials of worthiness historically approaches 90%. And that's when the trials are conducted by neutral parties with no particular agenda beyond testing. What we're facing here are actively hostile forces who would prefer to see you dead rather than successfully integrated into our family. The statistics are irrelevant, Klaus cut his sister off with sharp finality, his protective fury making the air around him shimmer with barely contained supernatural energy. She's not doing it. End of discussion. Isabella felt that familiar, suffocating burn of being protected to the point of helplessness, the same sensation that had driven her to face Daniel alone at that Manhattan party so many months ago rather than hide behind Nikolaus's supernatural protection. Everyone in the room was talking about her fate, debating her future, making decisions about her life while treating her like delicate crystal that might shatter under the slightest pressure. The irony was devastating. She'd spent her entire human life being told she wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy enough, wasn't strong enough to belong in elite circles. Now, in the supernatural world where she'd finally found acceptance and love, she was being told she was too precious, too fragile, too human to face the challenges that came with her choices. Stop, she said quietly, but her voice carried through the ancient stone chamber with the kind of command presence that made even supernatural beings pause. All of you, just stop talking about me like I'm not standing right here. I didn't survive Daniel's psychological warfare, pass supernatural trials at our wedding, and learn to navigate a world full of vampires and witches just to become a helpless princess locked in an ivory tower. Klaus's jaw clenched with the force of grinding stone. This is different, Isabella. Those previous challenges were controlled environments with rules, witnesses, and established protocols. These are enemies who want you dead, using ancient laws as nothing more than a legal excuse for sanctioned murder. Then we give them exactly what they're asking for, Isabella said, her voice growing stronger and more resolute with each word. "We prove, once and for all, definitively and publicly, that I belong in this family not because I was compelled or coerced, but because I chose this life with full knowledge of what it meant." The supernatural bond between them pulsed with Klaus's absolute terror at the thought of losing her, but underneath that fear, she felt something else, a reluctant pride in her courage and a recognition that the woman he'd fallen in love with had never been one to back down from a fight, even when the odds were overwhelming. Before Klaus could formulate another protective argument, the ancient castle itself seemed to shudder as supernatural energy crackled through the air like lightning seeking a target. The massive stone walls that had withstood Highland storms for over a millennium groaned under the pressure of magical forces pressing against their defenses, and every supernatural being in the room tensed as their enhanced senses detected the approach of something that made their predatory instincts scream warnings. Elijah's phone rang with an ominous tone that seemed to echo from the very stones themselves, a sound that suggested the call was being amplified by supernatural means far beyond normal technology. The ancient device, reinforced with magical protections to withstand their family's supernatural strength, vibrated against the stone table with enough force to leave cracks in the granite surface. He glanced at Klaus with the kind of meaningful look that had passed between them during centuries of supernatural warfare, a silent communication that asked whether they were ready to face whatever fresh hell was about to be unleashed upon their family. Klaus nodded grimly, his jaw set with the kind of determination that had carried him through 1,000 years of impossible battles, then gestured for his brother to answer on speaker. Nikolaus Michaelson, a voice that Isabella had hoped never to hear again, filled the war room with venomous familiarity that made her skin crawl and her newly enhanced senses recoil in disgust. But this wasn't the Daniel she remembered from their toxic relationship or even the broken, humiliated man from the Manhattan ballroom 6 months ago. Gone was the polished arrogance of Manhattan elite, replaced by something far more dangerous. This voice carried newfound confidence that seemed to pulse with supernatural energy, authority that definitely hadn't existed when he was merely a wealthy human playing power games in boardrooms and country clubs. There was something darker underneath his words now, something that made Isabella's enhanced intuition scream warnings about dangers she couldn't yet identify but could feel pressing against her consciousness like shadows given form and malevolent purpose. Klaus's eyes went completely black, not the golden amber of his werewolf heritage but the absolute darkness of his vampire nature pushed beyond any semblance of control. His supernatural nature bled through his carefully maintained human facade as ancient fury consumed him, centuries of protective instincts focusing into a laser-sharp point of homicidal intent directed at the man who dared threaten his wife. "The only thing that belongs to you, Daniel," Klaus said with deadly precision, each word carefully enunciated to convey the promise of creative violence, "is the painful death I've been saving for a special occasion. Though I'm beginning to think I should have made it much more elaborate, much more public, and significantly more educational for anyone else who might consider threatening what belongs to me." Now, Daniel's laugh was cold and completely unfamiliar, laced with power that definitely wasn't human and carried undertones of magical enhancement that suggested he'd been fundamentally changed by whatever supernatural forces had recruited him. "Is that any way to speak to someone who's trying to help rescue an innocent woman from supernatural captivity? I have some very powerful friends now, Nikolaus. Ancient friends. Friends who've explained exactly how creatures like you manipulate human minds, how you steal free will and twist it into something you call love, how you turn victims into willing participants in their own destruction." Isabella felt Klaus's rage through their bond, a tsunami of protective fury that threatened to consume everything in its path and leave nothing but ash and devastation in its wake. She'd felt him angry before, had witnessed his legendary temper during conflicts with supernatural enemies, but this was different. This was the fury of a being whose very existence was being challenged, whose love was being questioned, whose fundamental nature was being put on trial by someone he considered beneath contempt. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees as his supernatural aura pressed against everyone present, and Isabella realized she'd never seen him this close to losing complete control. Even his siblings stepped back slightly, recognizing the signs of their brother approaching the kind of berserker rage that had once leveled entire cities when something truly precious to him was threatened. "Isabella, darling," Daniel continued, his voice taking on that sickeningly sweet, condescending tone that reminded her of every manipulation he'd ever used during their relationship, every time he'd made her feel small and grateful for his attention, every moment when he'd convinced her that his version of love was the best she could ever hope to deserve. If you can hear me, and I know you're listening because he never lets you out of his sight, just say the word and this nightmare can all end. You don't have to pretend to love him anymore. You don't have to keep up this charade of willing participation in your own supernatural imprisonment. Isabella stepped closer to the phone, her bare feet silent on the ancient stone floors that had witnessed centuries of Michaelson family meetings, her silk nightgown billowing around her like battle armor made of shadows and moonlight. Every eye in the room was focused on her, waiting to see how the human bride would handle this psychological warfare, this attempt to undermine everything she'd built with Klaus through months of careful trust and genuine love. When her voice finally came, it was deadly calm in a way that made even Klaus pause, recognizing the tone she used when her considerable intelligence was focused like a weapon against a target that had underestimated her capacity for strategic thinking. "Hello, Daniel. Still making assumptions about what I want instead of bothering to ask me directly, I see. Some things never change, do they? You always did prefer your own version of reality to anything I might actually think or feel." "Isabella." Daniel's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine relief, but Isabella's enhanced hearing caught the calculated undertone that she'd learned to recognize during their toxic relationship, the way he modulated his emotion for maximum manipulative effect, the practiced vulnerability designed to make her feel guilty for standing up for herself. "Thank God you're still you, still thinking clearly despite whatever he's done to your mind. Listen to me very carefully. You're surrounded by monsters who've made you believe you chose this life willingly. But I know the real you, the woman I was going to marry before you disappeared into this supernatural nightmare. I know you could never willingly choose to become one of them." Isabella's hand found Klaus's across the stone table, their fingers intertwining as she drew strength from his solid presence while simultaneously offering him her own unwavering support. Through their bond, she felt his struggle between murderous rage and respect for her autonomy, his desperate need to protect her warring with his hard-won understanding that she needed to fight her own battles. "The real me?" Her voice turned ice-cold with a fury that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. The quiet, diplomatic woman they'd welcomed into their family was revealing depths of steel that had been forged in the fires of surviving Daniel's emotional abuse and emerging stronger. "The real me was the woman you tried to systematically destroy in front of hundreds of people because my background embarrassed your social status. The real me is someone you never bothered to know, Daniel, because you fell in love with who you thought I could become if you molded me properly, not who I actually was. They've poisoned your mind against me, turned you against your own species," Daniel continued desperately, and Isabella could hear other voices in the background now, voices that whispered in languages that predated human civilization, voices that spoke with the authority of beings older than recorded history, voices that made her newly awakened supernatural senses scream warnings about powers she couldn't comprehend but could feel pressing against the castle's magical defenses. "But it's not too late to remember who you were before he twisted your memories and emotions. My new allies have given me access to ancient magic, Isabella. Magic older than his family, stronger than his compulsion, powerful enough to break whatever supernatural chains he's wrapped around your mind and heart." Klaus stepped protectively in front of Isabella, his entire body radiating the kind of lethal intent that had made him the most feared predator in supernatural history. "Your allies," he said with deadly quiet that promised violence beyond human imagination, "are about to discover why my family has survived for 1,000 years while lesser threats turn to dust and distant memory. Just walk outside, Isabella," Daniel pressed on, completely ignoring Klaus as if the most dangerous vampire alive was beneath his notice, a tactical error that made Rebecca actually laugh with dark amusement. "Walk away from the monster and come to me, and I'll prove that everything you think you feel for him is an elaborate supernatural lie. I'll show you recovered memories of who you really were before he corrupted your mind. I'll give you back the life you were meant to have, the future we were supposed to build together before he stole you away." Isabella felt Klaus's internal battle through their bond, his barely contained urge to simply end this conversation by tracking down Daniel and demonstrating why threatening a Michaelson's family had historically been a fatal mistake, warring with his hard-earned respect for her strength and his growing understanding that she needed to handle this confrontation herself. She could sense his desperate desire to protect her from everything that could hurt her, balanced against his recognition that the woman he'd fallen in love with had never needed saving, she needed supporting. Around the room, Klaus's siblings watched with varying degrees of tension and barely controlled violence. Rebecca's hands were clenched into fists that could have crushed stone, her vampire features threatening to emerge as she listened to someone dare to psychologically torture the woman who'd become like a sister to her. Elijah's jaw was tight with the kind of controlled fury that had once toppled governments, while Cole looked ready to start a massacre that would paint the Scottish countryside red with the blood of everyone who dared threaten their family's newest member. They all understood what Daniel didn't, that Isabella Chin had been forged in fires that would have broken lesser spirits, that she'd survived emotional warfare that had taught her to recognize manipulation in all its forms, and that she'd emerged from that crucible with a strength that made her worthy of the Michaelson name in ways that had nothing to do with supernatural power and everything to do with unbreakable will. "You want me to walk outside?" Isabella asked with deceptive sweetness, her voice taking on a tone that made Klaus's lips curve in a smile that was equal parts pride and predatory anticipation. "To you? Just like the good old days when I trusted you to make decisions for my own life?" "Yes," Daniel breathed, and she could hear the triumph creeping into his voice, the assumption that she was still the same emotionally battered woman he'd systematically undermined during their relationship. The belief that deep down she was still grateful for any attention from him and desperate enough to accept whatever scraps of affection he was willing to offer. "Just like before, when you trusted me to take care of you, to guide you, to show you what real love looked like before these monsters filled your head with impossible dreams and supernatural lies." Isabella looked around the room at the family who'd welcomed her with open arms and fierce protection, who'd faced supernatural tribunals to defend her right to exist among them, who'd never once made her feel ashamed of her human origins or her complicated past. Then she looked at Klaus, her husband, her choice, her forever, and saw not the monster Daniel wanted her to see, but a man who'd spent months learning to be gentle because she'd asked him to, who'd faced his own psychological demons to become worthy of her love. But as she prepared to respond, memories suddenly flooded back with startling clarity, not of her relationship with Klaus, but of the months leading up to her breakup with Daniel. Details she'd buried so deep that even she had forgotten them until this moment of crystal-clear perspective. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of genuine sadness that made everyone in the room pause. "Do you remember the night 3 weeks before you called off our engagement? When you came home late from another business dinner and found me reading in the study?" There was silence on the other end of the phone, and Isabella could practically hear his confusion bleeding through the supernatural connection. "You asked me what I was reading," she continued, her voice growing stronger as the memories came flooding back with photographic precision. "And when I told you it was a first edition of Jane Austen that I'd saved for months to buy, you laughed. You actually laughed and said that I needed to stop wasting money on old books when I should be focusing on things that would help me fit into our social circle." Klaus's expression darkened as he began to understand where this was going, his supernatural hearing picking up Daniel's increasingly uncomfortable breathing on the other end of the call. "But that wasn't the worst part," Isabella continued, her voice taking on the kind of strength that came from finally speaking truth that had been buried under layers of self-doubt and gaslighting. "The worst part was when you saw how hurt I was, and instead of apologizing, you sat me down and explained why my interests were embarrassing to you. How my love of literature made me seem pretentious to your friends. How my passion for art history was a waste of time that wouldn't help advance our social standing." Around the room, the Michaelson siblings exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing understanding of exactly what kind of psychological warfare Isabella had survived before finding her way to their family. "You told me," Isabella's voice cracked slightly with the remembered pain, "that if I really loved you, I would try harder to become the kind of woman who could make you proud. You said that my background would always be a liability, but that if I worked hard enough to change everything about myself, you might be able to overlook where I came from." Klaus's hands clenched against the stone table with enough force to leave permanent impressions in granite that had withstood centuries of highland storms. Through their bond, Isabella felt his fury building to levels that threatened to shatter his legendary self-control, but she also felt something else, a fierce, protective love that recognized her strength and honored her need to face this ghost from her past. I spent the next 3 weeks trying to become someone else, Isabella continued, her voice growing steadier as she reclaimed her own narrative. I bought different clothes, changed my hair, started reading business magazines instead of poetry. I practiced talking about things I didn't care about and pretended to be interested in people who bored me. And you know what the really sad part was, Daniel? Isabella, you're remembering things wrong. Daniel's voice had lost some of its supernatural confidence, taking on the defensive tone she remembered from whenever she tried to confront him about his treatment of her. I was trying to help you reach your potential, trying to give you opportunities you never would have had otherwise. The sad part, Isabella continued, completely ignoring his interruption, was that for 3 weeks, I actually convinced myself that you were right. That love meant changing everything about yourself to make the other person comfortable. That I should be grateful someone like you was willing to work so hard to fix someone like me. She moved closer to the phone, her bare feet silent on ancient stones as she prepared to deliver the killing blow to the psychological chains he'd once wrapped around her heart. But then I met someone who fell in love with my passion for literature. Someone who spent decades collecting first editions of my favorite books just to see my face light up when he gave them to me. Someone who learned about art history because it mattered to me, who thought my background made me stronger rather than weaker, who saw my survival of your psychological abuse as proof that I was extraordinary, not damaged. Klaus's expression softened with something that transcended mere love, a recognition of the incredible strength it had taken for her to not just survive Daniel's systematic emotional destruction but to emerge from it with her sense of self not just intact but stronger than ever. So when you ask me to walk outside to you, Isabella concluded, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had finally, completely reclaimed her own power, what you're really asking is for me to give up everything I've discovered about my own worth and go back to being the broken, grateful woman who believed she didn't deserve real love. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for long moments, broken only by whispered voices in ancient languages that suggested Daniel's supernatural allies were conferring about this unexpected development. The answer, Daniel, Isabella said with finality that echoed through the ancient castle like a queen pronouncing judgment, is no. I will never again apologize for being exactly who I am. The silence that followed Isabella's declaration stretched through the ancient castle like a living thing, broken only by the distant sound of highland wind whistling through stone corridors that had witnessed centuries of Michaelson family triumphs and tragedies. For a moment, even the supernatural threats surrounding them seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the power of a woman finally reclaiming her own narrative from someone who had tried to rewrite it through manipulation and psychological warfare. Klaus moved toward Isabella with supernatural grace, his ancient eyes filled with something that transcended mere admiration. This was a pure, reverent recognition of strength that had nothing to do with supernatural power and everything to do with the kind of courage that could face down demons both literal and metaphorical. When he reached her, his hands cupped her face with the tenderness of someone handling the most precious artifact in existence. "My magnificent queen," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion that he'd never learned to express during his human life over a millennium ago. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? You've not only reclaimed your own power, you've just demonstrated to every supernatural being listening to this conversation why you belong in this family. Why you've always belonged here." Isabella leaned into his touch, feeling the solid strength of him anchoring her as the adrenaline of confronting her past began to ebb. Through their bond, she felt his fierce pride mixing with protective love and something else, a recognition that she just fought and won a battle that was entirely her own, using weapons he could never have given her because they came from depths of her own spirit that had been forged in fires he'd never experienced. Around them, Klaus's siblings moved closer in a gesture of unconscious family solidarity. Rebecca's expression had transformed from concern to fierce pride, while Elijah nodded with the kind of approval that came from recognizing tactical brilliance when he witnessed it. Even Cole, who typically treated serious moments with irreverent humor, looked genuinely impressed by the psychological warfare they'd just witnessed. That, Rebecca said with obvious admiration, was better than any supernatural trial could have been. You just proved that your mind can't be broken by anything, not emotional abuse, not manipulation, not even supernatural coercion. Any being with half a brain would recognize that kind of mental fortitude. But their moment of family bonding was interrupted by Daniel's voice, crackling back through the phone with a desperation that bordered on hysteria. The confident, supernaturally enhanced tone was completely gone, replaced by the raw panic of a man whose carefully constructed narrative had just been demolished in front of witnesses he'd been trying to impress. "You're wrong," he said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to regain control of the conversation. "You're remembering everything wrong, Isabella. I was trying to help you become your best self. I was trying to give you opportunities, connections, a chance at a life you never could have achieved on your own. And this monster, this creature, he's twisted those memories, made you think love was something it never was." Isabella looked at the phone with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been mixed with steel-hard resolve. "Daniel, I'm going to tell you something that might save your life, though I'm not entirely sure you deserve the warning." Klaus raised an eyebrow at his wife's tone, recognizing the particular inflection she used when her considerable intelligence was about to deliver a strategic masterstroke. "The man I married," Isabella continued, her voice carrying clearly through the supernatural connection, "is someone who has spent 1,000 years learning to recognize strength in all its forms. He survived longer than most civilizations by understanding exactly what makes people truly powerful, truly dangerous, truly worthy of respect. And when he looks at me, he sees someone who survived your psychological warfare not because she was weak enough to accept it, but because she was strong enough to endure it and emerge unbroken." She moved closer to the phone, her bare feet silent on ancient stones as she prepared to deliver what Klaus recognized as a perfectly calculated psychological strike. "But when he looks at you, Daniel, he sees someone so fundamentally weak that the only way you could feel powerful was by trying to diminish someone who loved you. Someone so terrified of real strength that you surrounded yourself with people who needed your money more than they respected your character. Someone so pathetic that even with supernatural allies and ancient magic backing you, you still can't accept that I chose to leave you behind." Klaus's smile was sharp enough to cut glass as he recognized the tactical brilliance of what his wife was doing. She wasn't just defending herself, she was systematically dismantling Daniel's psychological defenses using weapons he'd never encountered in supernatural warfare. "You want to know what real strength looks like, Daniel?" Isabella asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Real strength is a man who could tear you apart with his bare hands but chooses restraint because his wife asked him to let her handle this. Real strength is someone who's lived for centuries but still learns new ways to be gentle because gentleness matters to someone he loves. Real strength is facing the possibility of supernatural war because someone he cares about is being threatened, not by hiding behind magic and allies while trying to convince everyone that his target is too weak to make her own decisions." Through the phone, they could hear Daniel's increasingly labored breathing, punctuated by urgent whispered conversations in ancient languages that suggested his supernatural allies were rapidly reassessing their human recruit. "Your allies are starting to understand something you never did," Isabella concluded with devastating precision. "I was never the weak link in our relationship, Daniel. You were. And now you've made yourself the weak link in whatever supernatural alliance you've cobbled together, because you've proven that your judgment about human nature is fundamentally flawed." Klaus pulled Isabella closer, his arms wrapping around her with protective pride as he felt her slight trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of verbal combat that required every bit as much courage as physical warfare. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, the words carrying weight that went beyond simple affection. "I love your strength, your courage, your brilliant mind, and your absolutely devastating ability to dismantle psychological warfare using nothing but truth and tactical precision." For just a moment, surrounded by family who understood both her strength and her vulnerability, Isabella felt like they might actually survive whatever supernatural storm was gathering around them. She'd faced down her psychological demons and emerged victorious, proven her worthiness through mental rather than physical trials, and demonstrated that her human spirit was unbreakable. But that moment of peace was shattered by new voices coming through the phone, ancient voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, voices that carried the authority of beings who had decided that this psychological approach had failed and more direct methods were required. Enough, came a voice that seemed to speak directly into their minds rather than through the phone, a voice that made the castle's ancient stones vibrate with supernatural resonance. The human has proven interesting, but she still must face the trials properly. At dawn, in the courtyard, or we begin killing the villagers below, one every hour, until she complies. The phone went dead, leaving them in a silence that felt heavy with impending doom. Klaus's expression hardened into something that promised violence beyond imagination. "They just made their final mistake," he said with deadly quiet. "They threatened innocence to force my wife's hand. That's not supernatural politics anymore, that's war." Isabella looked up at him, seeing the predator who'd terrified supernatural beings for a millennium, but also seeing the man who'd just watched her fight her own battle and been proud of her victory. "Then we give them a war they'll never forget," she said softly. "But we do it together. As a family." The dawn light was beginning to filter through the ancient stained glass windows when Klaus made the decision that would shatter everything they built together. Isabella had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep on the stone bench in the war room, curled against his side like a cat seeking warmth, her breathing finally even after hours of supernatural tension and psychological warfare. She looked so small, so mortal, so impossibly fragile in the ethereal morning light that painted her skin with colors of rose gold and lavender. For 3 hours, Klaus had sat perfectly still, his supernatural senses tracking every breath she took while his mind raced through tactical scenarios that all ended in variations of catastrophic loss. Every strategic option led to the same inescapable conclusion: the trials awaiting her were designed not to test her worthiness, but to ensure her destruction in ways that would be technically legal under supernatural law while providing maximum entertainment for ancient beings who viewed human life as disposable. His siblings had been taking turns monitoring the supernatural forces surrounding the castle, reporting back with intelligence that painted an increasingly grim picture. The Bennett Coven had established magical barriers that would prevent any supernatural intervention once the trials began. The Salvatore faction had positioned vampire hunters with weapons specifically designed to incapacitate rather than kill supernatural beings, ensuring that Klaus and his family would be forced to watch helplessly. And Daniel's mysterious allies had revealed themselves to be members of the ancestral court, ancient supernatural beings who existed primarily to maintain the cosmic balance between human and supernatural worlds, beings so old and powerful that even Klaus's family treated them with careful respect. When Elijah returned from his latest reconnaissance mission, his expression grave enough to convey devastating news without words, Klaus carefully extracted himself from Isabella's sleeping form and moved to the far corner of the room where they could speak without waking her. "It's worse than we thought," Elijah reported in the kind of whisper that carried clearly to supernatural ears but wouldn't penetrate human sleep. "The trials aren't standard tests of worthiness. They're specifically designed challenges based on Isabella's psychological profile, information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of her fears and vulnerabilities." Klaus felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. Daniel provided them with detailed information about her past trauma, her specific triggers, her deepest insecurities. Elijah continued, his voice heavy with the kind of fury that came from witnessing calculated cruelty. "They've crafted trials that will target her emotional wounds with surgical precision, using her own psychological scars against her in ways that will appear fair to outside observers while being specifically designed to break her spirit." The ancient stone wall cracked under Klaus's grip as the full implications crashed through his consciousness. What kinds of trials? The first trial forces her to relive every moment of emotional abuse from her relationship with Daniel, but amplified through magical enhancement until the psychological pain becomes physical agony. Elijah's voice was barely controlled. The second trial places her in scenarios where she must choose between her own survival and the lives of innocents, designed to exploit her natural protectiveness and ensure that any choice she makes will haunt her forever. Klaus closed his eyes, feeling their supernatural bond carry echoes of Isabella's peaceful dreams, completely unaware of the psychological minefield awaiting her in just a few hours. "And the third trial?" he asked, though he was no longer certain he wanted to know. "The third trial," Elijah said with the kind of quiet that preceded apocalyptic violence, "forces her to experience your death, in exquisite detail, over and over again, until she either breaks completely or somehow finds the strength to function despite believing you're gone forever." That was the moment Klaus made his decision. Not the rational choice of a man who trusted his wife's strength, not the supportive decision of a partner who respected her autonomy, but the desperate choice of a being whose fundamental fear of loss overrode every lesson he'd learned about love and respect during their relationship. He moved to where Isabella slept, his supernatural speed allowing him to position himself beside her before anyone could react to what he was about to do. His ancient eyes met those of his siblings, conveying both his decision and his absolute determination to see it through regardless of their objections. "No," Rebecca breathed, recognizing the look in her brother's eyes. "Klaus, don't you dare." "I'm sorry, love," Klaus whispered, his hand touching Isabella's forehead with the gentleness that had become second nature during their relationship. "But I won't let them destroy you. Not even if it means you hate me forever." Isabella's eyes fluttered open just as Klaus's vampire compulsion slammed into her mind with the force of a supernatural battering ram, his ancient will pressing against her consciousness with power that had bent kings and emperors to his desires for over a millennium. "You will leave this place," he commanded, his voice carrying supernatural authority that rewrote human will like editing text on a page. "You will take the car, drive to the airport, and fly back to New Orleans. You will not remember these trials, will not remember this threat, will not remember anything that happened after we arrived at the castle. You will wait for me there, safe and protected, until I return." But even as the compulsion poured from him with devastating force, Klaus felt something that made his supernatural blood run cold: resistance. Not the simple mental barriers that most humans possessed, but something deeper, something that seemed to rise from the very core of Isabella's being like an immune system rejecting foreign infection. Isabella's eyes snapped fully open, and instead of the glassy compliance that should have followed successful compulsion, Klaus saw something that made his heart stop hurt so profound it seemed to physically wound him through their bond, betrayal so complete it felt like death itself. "You tried to compel me," she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of broken disbelief that came from discovering the person you trusted most had just attempted to violate the most fundamental aspect of your being. You actually tried to take away my free will." Klaus felt the compulsion failing, crumbling against something in Isabella's mind that he'd never encountered in a millennium of bending human consciousness to his desires. But the failure of his supernatural ability was nothing compared to the devastation in her eyes as she realized what he'd attempted. "Isabella, I can explain," he began, but she was already pulling away from him, her entire body recoiling from his touch as if he'd become something venomous. "You promised me," her voice broke completely, tears streaming down her face as the full betrayal crashed through her consciousness. "You promised that what we had was real, that I chose this, that my free will mattered to you. And at the first real challenge, the first moment when trusting my strength became inconvenient, you tried to turn me into a puppet. The trials will kill you," Klaus said desperately, reaching for her only to have her step further away. "They're designed specifically to break you, using everything Daniel knows about your psychological vulnerabilities. I was trying to save your life." "By taking away everything that made my life worth living," Isabella shot back, her voice rising with a fury that made even his siblings take notice. "By proving that when it really matters, you see me exactly the same way Daniel did, as someone too weak to make her own decisions, too fragile to face her own challenges, too human to be trusted with her own choices." The words hit Klaus like physical blows, each syllable landing with devastating accuracy against psychological wounds he thought were healed. "That's not. I love you, Isabella. Everything I do is to protect you." "You love owning me," Isabella said with deadly precision, her voice taking on the kind of cold fury that cut deeper than any physical weapon. "You love the idea of a human who chose you, but the moment that choice becomes dangerous, you try to take it away. You're no different from Daniel, Klaus. You just use supernatural powers instead of emotional manipulation to control what I do." Around them, the ancient castle seemed to hold its breath as the most powerful vampire in existence faced the complete destruction of everything he thought he understood about love and partnership. His siblings watched in horrified silence as their brother's greatest triumph, finding someone who loved him for exactly who he was, transformed into his most devastating defeat. "I would rather die facing these trials as myself than live forever as whatever you tried to turn me into," Isabella continued, her words falling like hammer blows against Klaus's supernatural heart. "At least Daniel was honest about seeing me as something to be controlled. You made me believe I was an equal partner while keeping compulsion in your back pocket for whenever my choices became inconvenient." Klaus felt something breaking inside him that had nothing to do with supernatural power and everything to do with the realization that in trying to save the woman he loved, he'd become the very thing she needed saving from in the first place. "Isabella, please," he whispered, but she was already moving toward the door, her bare feet silent on stones that had witnessed centuries of Michaelson heartbreak but never anything quite like this. "Don't," she said without turning around, her voice carrying finality that echoed through the ancient chamber like a funeral bell. "Don't follow me. Don't try to explain. Don't try to fix this with more supernatural solutions. I'm going to face these trials because that's who I am, and apparently, that's exactly what you can't accept." As the heavy oak door closed behind her with devastating finality, Klaus sank to his knees on ancient stones, surrounded by his siblings but more alone than he'd been in 1,000 years of existence. The supernatural bond between them still carried her emotions, betrayal, heartbreak, and underneath it all, a determination that remained unbroken despite everything he'd just destroyed. He'd lost her. Not to supernatural trials or ancient enemies or psychological warfare, but to his own inability to trust that the strength he'd fallen in love with was real enough to survive challenges he couldn't face for her. And in just a few hours, she was going to face those trials alone, carrying not just the weight of supernatural expectations but the additional burden of knowing that even the man who claimed to love her had tried to steal her choice when it mattered most. The ancient courtyard of Raven's Hollow Castle had been transformed into an arena that seemed designed by nightmares and implemented by beings who viewed human suffering as entertainment. Isabella stood alone at the center of the stone circle, surrounded by supernatural forces that had arranged themselves like spectators at a gladiatorial match, their presence a crushing weight that made the morning air feel thick and oppressive. The Bennett witches had formed a perfect circle around the perimeter, their combined magical energy creating barriers that shimmered with power while ensuring that no supernatural being could interfere once the trials began. The Salvatore faction positioned themselves with military precision, vervain-laced weapons trained on every possible entrance to ensure the Michaelson family would be forced to watch helplessly from the castle's upper windows. And towering above them all were the representatives of the ancestral court, ancient beings whose forms seemed to shift between human and something far more primordial, their very presence making reality bend around them like light refracting through water. Isabella had spent the 2 hours since her confrontation with Klaus preparing herself with the methodical precision of a soldier readying for battle. She'd braided her hair with steady hands despite the trembling in her chest, dressed in simple clothes that wouldn't restrict movement, and spent long minutes staring at her reflection in the ancient mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. The face in the glass was still hers, but something fundamental had changed in those devastating moments when Klaus had tried to compel her. The absolute trust that had allowed her to love a vampire, the complete faith that had let her enter a supernatural world, the unshakable belief that she was valued for who she was rather than what she could be controlled into becoming, all of it had cracked like glass under the weight of his betrayal. But underneath the hurt, underneath the sense of betrayal that felt like physical wounds carved into her soul, something else burned with steady flame. The same determination that had carried her through Daniel's psychological warfare, the same strength that had allowed her to pass supernatural trials at their wedding, the same unbreakable core that had attracted Klaus's attention in the first place. She would face these trials not because she had to, but because proving her worth to herself, to these ancient beings, to the supernatural world that questioned her right to exist among them, was who she was at the most fundamental level. Meanwhile, for floors above in the war room that had become his prison of regret, Klaus sat motionless at the stone table, his supernatural senses tracking every heartbeat, every breath, every micro-expression of the woman he'd lost through his own arrogance and fear. Through their bond, he felt her preparing herself for trials designed to break her, felt her drawing on reserves of strength he tried to steal from her, felt her facing alone what they should have confronted together. His siblings had been taking turns trying to reach him, offering strategies, alternatives, hope that there might still be time to fix what he'd shattered. But Klaus remained frozen in his chair, paralyzed not by supernatural force but by the crushing realization of what he'd become in those moments when fear had overridden everything he'd learned about love and partnership. "You have to do something," Rebecca said for the 10th time in as many minutes, her voice sharp with desperation as she watched the supernatural tribunal assembling below. "Say something, fix this, find a way to reach her before they begin. You can't just sit there while she faces this alone." "What would you have me do, sister?" Klaus asked without moving, his voice carrying the kind of emptiness that came from having your fundamental beliefs about yourself shattered beyond repair. "Tell her again that I love her? Explain again that I was trying to protect her? Prove once more that when it truly matters, I see her as something to be controlled rather than someone to be trusted?" Elijah moved to the window that provided the clearest view of the courtyard, his expression grim as he assessed the supernatural forces arrayed against their family. "The trials begin in 10 minutes. If you're going to reach out to her, if you're going to try to repair this, it has to be now." Klaus finally lifted his head, his ancient eyes meeting his brother's with something that transcended mere pain. "And what exactly should I say, Elijah?" "That I'm sorry for proving that everything Daniel said about supernatural creatures controlling humans was absolutely correct. That I apologize for demonstrating that my love comes with conditions that include giving up her free will whenever I deem it necessary for her safety?" The truth of his own words hit him like supernatural force applied directly to psychological wounds that would never fully heal. He hadn't just tried to compel Isabella, he'd validated every fear she'd ever had about loving a vampire, proven every warning she'd been given about the impossibility of equal partnership between human and supernatural beings, demonstrated that when push came to shove, he was exactly the monster his enemies claimed he was. "She would have died," Klaus whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Those trials are designed specifically to break her. Daniel gave them everything they needed to target her psychological vulnerabilities with surgical precision. I was trying to save her life. By taking away everything that made her life worth living," Cole pointed out with the brutal honesty that was his particular specialty. "By proving that your love is conditional on her being weak enough to need saving rather than strong enough to face her own challenges." Through the supernatural bond they shared, Klaus felt Isabella's spike of adrenaline as the first trial began. Her fear was sharp and immediate, but underneath it burned something that made his heart ache with recognition, determination that remained unbroken despite everything he'd put her through. She was facing supernatural torture designed to exploit her deepest psychological wounds, and she was doing it while carrying the additional burden of knowing that even the man who claimed to love her had tried to steal her choice when it mattered most. "I have to go to her," Klaus said suddenly, rising from his chair with supernatural speed that blurred reality around him. "I have to tell her. I have to explain." "Explain what?" Rebecca's voice cut through his desperate planning like a blade through silk. "That you're sorry for proving you see her exactly the way her abusive ex-boyfriend did? That you apologize for attempting to commit the one violation of trust that she could never forgive? That you regret demonstrating that your protective instincts are more important to you than her autonomy?" Each word landed like physical blows, forcing Klaus to confront the magnitude of what he'd done in those moments when fear had overridden love. He'd spent months earning Isabella's trust, proving that supernatural beings could love humans without needing to control them, demonstrating that strength could coexist with respect for free will. And in one moment of panic, he destroyed all of it, proving that his love came with invisible strings attached. "She's going to die down there," Klaus said desperately, his hands clenching against the stone table with enough force to leave permanent impressions in granite that had withstood centuries of highland storms. "Those trials are designed to kill her while appearing fair to supernatural observers. And I'll have to watch it happen, knowing that she's facing it alone because I tried to steal the very thing that made her worthy of survival in the first place. Below in the courtyard, Isabella's scream of psychological agony carried through the morning air as the first trial forced her to relive every moment of emotional abuse from her relationship with Daniel, amplified through magical enhancement until mental pain became physical torture. Klaus felt every spike of her suffering through their bond, felt her fighting to maintain her sense of self while supernatural forces tried to convince her that she was worthless, unwanted, deserving of nothing better than psychological cruelty. But even through the torture, even through agony designed to break human minds, Klaus felt something else from Isabella that made him realize the true magnitude of his betrayal. She wasn't just surviving the trial, she was drawing strength from her own experiences, using her survival of Daniel's abuse as armor against supernatural attempts to break her spirit. The woman he tried to protect by stealing her agency was demonstrating strength that put his own supernatural power to shame. His phone buzzed with a text, and Klaus's hands shook as he read the message Isabella had somehow managed to send between trials. "I'm not doing this to prove I'm strong enough for your world. I'm doing this to prove I'm strong enough for mine. Don't try to save me. If you love me at all, trust me to save myself." Klaus stared at the message until the letters blurred, realizing that she just offered him one final chance, not for forgiveness, which would have to be earned through actions rather than words, but for redemption. A chance to prove that he could love her the way she deserved to be loved, with trust rather than control, with respect for her strength rather than fear of her mortality. He could race down to the courtyard, use his supernatural power to end the trials through force, and rescue her in a way that would prove once and for all that he saw her as something to be protected rather than someone to be respected. Or he could do the hardest thing he'd ever attempted in 1,000 years of existence. He could trust the woman he loved to fight her own battles, even when every instinct screamed at him to intervene. Klaus closed his eyes, feeling Isabella facing the second trial with courage that humbled him, and made his choice. The third trial ended with Isabella still standing in the center of the supernatural arena, her body trembling with exhaustion but her spirit unbroken despite 3 hours of psychological warfare designed to destroy human minds. She had relived every moment of Daniel's emotional abuse amplified through magical torture, chosen to sacrifice herself repeatedly to save innocent villagers in scenarios designed to exploit her protective nature, and experienced Klaus's death in exquisite detail over and over until the pain became white noise against her consciousness. But she was still standing. Still breathing. Still fundamentally, unshakably herself. The representatives of the ancestral court conferred among themselves in languages that predated human civilization, their ancient voices carrying notes of something that might have been surprise. The Bennett witches maintained their magical barriers with expressions that had shifted from confident expectation to grudging respect. Even the Salvatore faction lowered their weapons slightly, recognizing that they had just witnessed something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about human fragility in the face of supernatural force. "The trials are complete," announced the lead representative of the ancestral court, her voice carrying across the courtyard with supernatural resonance that made the ancient stones vibrate in harmony. "The human has proven adequate for integration into supernatural society. She may retain her place among the Michaelson family." Isabella lifted her chin with the same defiance that had first caught Klaus's attention 6 months ago, her voice carrying clearly despite her exhaustion. "I don't need your permission to love who I choose or to belong where I belong. I never did. These trials weren't about proving my worthiness to you, they were about proving to myself that no one, supernatural or otherwise, gets to define my value except me." The ancient being's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. "Indeed. Perhaps we have learned as much as you have today." As the supernatural forces began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied and their ancient laws appeased, Isabella remained alone in the center of the courtyard. She had proven everything that needed proving, had faced down centuries of supernatural prejudice and emerged victorious. But the taste of triumph was bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge that the one person whose respect and trust mattered most to her had tried to steal her chance to prove herself. That's when the air around her began to shimmer with supernatural energy that made every remaining witness pause and take notice. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant, shadows lengthened despite the midday sun, and power pressed against the ancient stones with enough force to make the castle itself groan in recognition. Klaus appeared not through walking or supernatural speed, but through what could only be described as reality bending around his will to manifest him exactly where he needed to be. His entrance was the stuff of legend, power made visible, authority incarnate, the kind of dramatic arrival that reminded everyone present why he'd been feared for over a millennium. But this wasn't the Klaus who solved problems through superior force or strategic intimidation. This Klaus approached Isabella not with the confident stride of a supernatural king claiming his queen, but with the careful, reverent steps of a man who had almost lost everything that mattered and was asking for permission to hope for redemption. "My love," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the weight of 1,000 years of regret distilled into 2 simple words. "I have come not to rescue you, not to protect you, not to solve your problems or shield you from consequences. I have come to apologize." Isabella turned to face him, her expression unreadable as she took in the most powerful vampire in existence approaching her with humility that must have cost him everything to display in front of supernatural witnesses. "I tried to take away the very thing that made you worthy of love in the first place," Klaus continued, stopping several feet away from her, close enough to speak intimately but far enough to show respect for her space and autonomy. "Your strength. Your courage. Your right to make your own choices, even when those choices terrify me. I became the very thing you'd suffered under before, someone who claimed to love you while trying to control you." The remaining supernatural beings watched in fascinated silence as the original hybrid, the first vampire, the most feared predator in their world, laid his heart bare before a human woman who had every right to walk away from him forever. "I have spent the last 3 hours watching you face trials designed to break you, feeling your pain through our bond while forcing myself not to intervene," Klaus's voice cracked with emotion that echoed off ancient stones. "And I have learned something that a millennium of existence failed to teach me, that loving someone means trusting their strength even when that trust feels like dying, especially when that trust feels like dying." Isabella studied his face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with the kind of hard-won understanding that only came from having your fundamental beliefs shattered and rebuilt through pain. "You tried to compel me," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of betrayal that hadn't diminished despite her victory in the trials. "I did," Klaus admitted without excuse or explanation, his ancient eyes meeting hers directly. "And in doing so, I proved that I saw you as Daniel did, as someone too fragile to make difficult decisions, too human to be trusted with dangerous choices. I became exactly the monster you'd been warned about when you entered our world." "Yes," Isabella agreed, and Klaus felt their bond carry the sharp edges of pain that might never fully heal. "You did. I cannot undo what I attempted," Klaus continued, his voice steady despite the devastation in his expression. "I cannot take back the moment when I proved that my love came with conditions that included surrendering your free will. But I can promise you this, I will spend eternity learning to love you the way you deserve, with trust instead of control, with respect for your strength instead of fear of your mortality." Isabella was quiet for long moments, studying the man who had just offered her the one thing she'd never expected from their relationship, an acknowledgement that he needed to change, to grow, to become worthy of the love she'd given him freely. "I don't forgive you," she said finally, and Klaus felt their bond carry the finality of judgment rendered. "Not yet. Forgiveness is something that has to be earned through actions, not words." Klaus nodded, accepting the verdict with more grace than he'd shown for most of his supernatural existence. "I understand." "But," Isabella continued, and Klaus felt their bond carry the first stirring of something that might eventually become hope, "I'm willing to give you the chance to earn it. To prove that you can love me as an equal partner instead of a possession to be protected." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the scent of her skin mixed with the supernatural energy that still clung to her from the trials. "I'm willing to teach you how to trust my strength instead of fearing my humanity. To show you that real love isn't about keeping someone safe from every possible harm, it's about supporting them while they face those harms themselves." Klaus reached for her hands with the careful reverence of someone handling priceless artifacts, his supernatural strength gentle to the point of barely touching her skin. "I would be honored to learn from you," he said with complete sincerity. "To become worthy of the strength you've shown today." Isabella looked into his ancient eyes, seeing not the monster who tried to steal her agency or the supernatural king who solved problems through power, but the man who'd learned to paint watercolors because she loved art, who'd spent months earning her trust one gentle gesture at a time. "Then we do this together," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced down supernatural tribunals and emerged victorious. "As equals. As partners. With the understanding that if you ever try to make decisions for me again, if you ever try to steal my choices to keep me safe, I will leave and never come back." Klaus lifted her hands to his lips, pressing kisses against her knuckles with the solemnity of religious ritual. "Together," he agreed. "Always together. I promise you, my magnificent, terrifying, absolutely unstoppable queen, I will never again try to protect you from yourself." As they stood together in the ancient courtyard, surrounded by the evidence of her victory and his humility, Isabella felt something shift in their relationship. Not healing that would take time and proven actions, but the foundation for rebuilding something stronger than what they'd lost. A love based on mutual respect rather than protective control, trust rather than fear, partnership rather than possession. "Take me home, husband," she said with a small smile that carried more hope than triumph. "But remember, I'm choosing to come with you. That choice belongs to me." Klaus's answering smile was radiant with relief, love, and the kind of wonder that came from being offered redemption by someone who had every right to walk away. "As you wish, my love. Always as you wish." They walked away from the supernatural arena hand in hand, not as vampire king and rescued human bride, but as two people who had learned that real love meant trusting each other's strength enough to face the world together. And for the first time since their honeymoon began, Isabella felt like they might actually have forever to figure out how to love each other properly. And that is how you rebuild a love story from the ashes of betrayal and prove that real strength comes from choosing to trust again even when you've been hurt. If you made it through this entire emotional roller coaster without subscribing, you're seriously breaking my heart worse than Klaus broke Isabella's trust. I just gave you nearly 50 minutes of the most intense supernatural romance saga ever told, stayed up multiple nights crafting every twist and emotional beat, and you're really going to scroll away without joining our vampire family? Don't you dare ghost me now. Hit that subscribe button and become part of the fastest growing supernatural love story community on YouTube. Tell me in the comments if you think Klaus truly deserves forgiveness or if Isabella should have walked away forever. Also, drop where in the world you're watching from because I absolutely need to know where my devoted supernatural romance addicts are located. What was your favorite moment? Isabella proving her unbreakable strength in those trials, Klaus learning to trust rather than control, or that emotional reconciliation where they chose to rebuild together? And honestly, do you think Klaus will keep his promise to never try to make decisions for Isabella again, or is his protective nature too strong to overcome? Drop your predictions below because I'm already planning part 3 and your theories might just inspire the next chapter of their story.